So yeah, for me, it's really about going to the diet, making sure first of all, intakes and energy intake is sufficient, because as a woman who's given birth, it's it's pretty damn hard. So just making sure those cows are fully supported through that period in terms of energy. But yeah, definitely going to the mineral profile in the short term, the mineral profile of the pasture or feed. If you're using supplements like maize silage or something like that, it's kind of understanding, how they're contributing as well. So what are the risks or advantages of using those supplementary feeds?
I'm excited to share that this podcast is brought to you by GroundShift. GroundShift is a whole farm advisory business built to help farmers make better decisions for their soil, their system, their bottom line, and their long-term goals. They partner with farmers to build high-performing, biologically led systems that deliver consistent profitability, greater health, and long-term resilience. At the heart of what GroundShift does is to take a system-wide approach to your farm system. They look at soil, pasture performance, animal performance, finances, and management, and that gives you the clarity on where your real opportunities are. Right now, GroundShift have opened up a limited number of spots in their pilot program. This is the chance to work hands-on with the GroundShift team to put strategy into action and start shifting your farm towards greater resilience and profitability. If you're curious about a more integrated, biologically grounded approach to farm performance, this is the place to start. So head to www.groundshift.ag or follow groundshift.ag on Instagram. Welcome back to another episode of From the Soil Up podcast. Today's special guest is Emily House. I've had the pleasure of knowing Emily for at least 12 months now, and she has a heap of experience when it comes to plant nutrition and how that flows through from the pasture to the animal. I actually had my first proper exposure to her with the Create program when she hosts a module on plant and animal health nutrition. So I'm really excited to have this conversation today because I think this connection needs to be made more within our livestock farming systems. So, Emily, how are you today?
Well, thanks, Conan, and thanks for having me on.
It's fantastic to have you on, and I know there's a heap of knowledge that we're going to get through today, which is going to be awesome. So, Emily, how does plant-mineral balance directly influence livestock performance?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think the common saying, we are what we eat, really applies to this, as it applies as much to our production animals as it does to ourselves. And in pasture-based systems, the plant is making up a significant proportion, if not all, of the diet, mineral supplementation aside, and so that's where the animals are getting all their minerals from. So if a pasture or crop is either deficient or excessive or imbalanced in minerals, then this is going to be reflected back into the animal as measurable performance losses or nutrition-related diseases. So, even when energy and protein are adequate, that mineral imbalance can limit growth and performance.
So when we, off the back of that, I guess when we see supplements used to try and solve these mineral deficiencies or excesses within our systems, do you think that's masking a bit of a deeper system dysfunction?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And the vet that kind of started the business where this all began and developed the model that I've been working with, he always used to say that the greater the need for supplementation, the greater the risk of failure. So the question is, why are we needing to supplement, And often the propping up of the system is really obvious in your high input ration systems. But in pasture-based systems, that appear quite natural. And, we've got that grass-fed brand. I think sometimes that hidden dysfunction is really hard to comprehend. And so in these scenarios, the animal stays supported while perhaps the ecosystem or the soil is declining. So yeah, there's lots of examples you could give about that, but it's things like, is it masking or is it a substitute for plant diversity? So, could we get some more minerals into our animals by introducing more diversity into our plant species? In some regions, it's going to be a straight deficiency in the soil. So you are going to need to supplement. If it's not in the soil, it's not going to be in the plant. Therefore, it's not going to be in the animal. And again, it's thinking about, what's influencing the mineral profile of the pasture. Are our nutrients cycling through our soil like we expect them to? And kind of, if we're constantly having to supplement with things that maybe are in the soil but not in the plant, what's impacting that.
That's a great point there. So what sort of things do impact, if we do have good available levels of, say, trace elements in the soil, but they're not coming through to the plant and therefore the animal, how would a farmer know that that is occurring, I guess, is probably a great place to start.
Yeah, well, I think that's where pairing soil and plant testing is really important. So, identifying, most farmers are familiar with taking soil tests. I'm not sure how common it is to do trace elements, but definitely getting an understanding of the trace elements on your farm, in your soils, is really important. And then, if you conduct that herbage or plant tissue testing, you're going to be able to see if that trace element is actually coming through to the plant and how well it's coming through, like what are the levels in that plant. And then that's going to determine your supplementation requirements for the animals, if it's low or high. And so then it's thinking about the things that might impact on that. So, grasses aren't as good as taking up trace elements as the deeper rooted herbs that we might use, like plantain and chicory. They'll accumulate, they've got a deep taproot, so they're going to accumulate those trace elements much better. And that's going to lift your overall levels in your pasture and therefore to the animal. Any kind of, compaction, loss of biology in your soils so that you're not getting that mineral cycling is going to affect the availability to the plant from the soil. So yeah, I think it's just thinking about those things that are impacting on it.
That's fascinating around the plants obviously accessing different types of nutrients as well. I don't think a lot of context is explained about that when you're putting in pasture diversity as well. So before we get a bit deeper into it, Emily, can you please introduce yourself and share a bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, Emily, I am actually Australian. Don't hold it against me. So I started out as a geologist a very long time ago. I have an earth science degree, and I spent about 8 years working as a geologist in Victoria, mainly around kind of greenfields exploration. Supporting greenfields exploration. And that was really interesting. It gave me a lot of understanding of chemistry, landscape function, that kind of stuff. And then 15 years ago, we decided to move our family, my husband and my 2 daughters, to New Zealand because my husband is a Kiwi. And I randomly got a job working for a couple of vets, supporting them in their new business, which was around preventative animal health. So they were tired of being the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, and they wanted to identify how they could actually prevent some of these really common production diseases. And the conclusion that in particular Pat Paletti, one of the vets, came to was blood and tissue testing, while is really valuable, especially when there's like deficiencies around animal nutrition, it didn't always diagnose an insufficiency in the animal. And so he found that when he used dietary analysis, so looking at the pastures and what the animals are eating, and using that to determine their requirements, then he actually got production responses by supplementing, even though the blood tissue testing was saying that everything was in that normal range. And so, yeah, I was working with them for 10 to 12 years before Pat unfortunately passed away, and then decided to continue on the business. I was trained up in the nutrition side of stuff. And yeah, from there we developed some software that does the kind of analytical side of stuff. And yeah, just had a go at commercializing the software in New Zealand. But yeah, a couple of years ago, we decided to put that aside for the minute. And since then, I've been working as a EOV monitor, so ecological outcome verification, which is fantastic. It gives you a really deep understanding of ecosystem function and how that works on farms and what are the practices and management that are impacting that. And yeah, also continuing on with some animal health consultancy. That's a brief breakdown of
Yeah, you've got quite an interesting background. I'm interested to see how, obviously you did plant nutrition for quite some time and now the EOV and the ecosystem work. Did you start seeing some parallels in what you had done in nutrition to how that played out on farm and what you were seeing there as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think observing particularly visual soil indicators on farms and relating that, and also lack of or diversity in pastures, because that's one of the things that we look at in terms of supporting community dynamics on a farm and in an ecosystem. Yeah, there was definitely links around the health of those indicators that we're looking at, and mineral nutrition in pastures and how well that's supplying to the animal. And so, you go on a farm and you can feel the life in that farm, right? And you can't really explain it, but you just feel it. And then you're trained to observe the different things that you're looking at. But the easiest way to tell is by looking at the animals, because they will reflect back to you the state of the ecosystem as a whole.
That is such a great point, is that observing your animals and seeing the feedback that you get from them, whether it be behaviour or their coats, all things like that, are actually great indicators of how your ecosystem is functioning as well. So that would have been very interesting work to kind of start piecing those puzzles together.
Yeah.
So when we talk about, I guess, pasture quality in New Zealand, we really focus on what seems like we focus on energy and protein. Why do we think, or why do you feel like mineral uptake doesn't get the same spotlight?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think there's maybe a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, I think it's due to the complexity involved in understanding how minerals link to animal health and performance from your pastures. With protein and energy, it's really easy to identify if there's too little or too much. Often your animals will tell you. And so these are your first limiting factors, and they're really important to get right. But once you've sorted those out, then there's a whole lot of different mineral imbalances that could be contributing to animal health problems. And while there's a huge amount of research into the requirements of these minerals in animals, making that link between a pasture-based diet and animal health and performance issues isn't so easy. And also, I think, the tendency, and for good reason, is to have used bloods and livers testing of animals, so using the animal to diagnose mineral deficiencies. But yeah, so we're testing the outcome and then supplementing accordingly. But sometimes, it's not a good indicator of how much of a mineral you need to support that outcome. And yeah, it's not, blood and tissue testing isn't, it's difficult to estimate the mineral requirement of a flock or herd from that. Whereas if you know what's in the diet, it's much easier to understand supply and demand. But again, there's complexity in that. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think, blood and tissue testing still has its place. But do you think I guess when I see that, it's normally like, 5 animals out of the whole herd, and how are you picking them? So you can probably see some quite variation in that 5 animals a herd. So what's the average that you're seeing across the board? So having a bit more of that complete picture in terms of what's going into the animal is probably, as you say, a bit of a safer estimation.
Yeah. I think there's value in using them together, definitely. And, with some of the trace elements, they can be toxic. So, you need to understand how you're using them, what the animal levels actually are, because, different breeds have a different metabolism for some of these minerals. The obvious one is copper and Texel sheep. So these are things that, you need to be able to understand, and that's where the animal testing is really useful. But yeah, I think definitely around that insufficiency level of a mineral. So where you might have like a healthy looking herd, but they're not performing like you expect, and you kind of can't identify why that is, then I think that's where that plant tissue or feed testing is just so helpful. Understanding, are they getting enough to support optimal production, or the production you'd like to get from them? Yeah,
I think that's quite an important point, is around how does this actually translate to, I guess, the profitability or the performance from your system? Because a lot of farmers see it as additional cost, and what's the actual value that comes back off the end. How influential do you think this sort of testing is? Because it's actually not a massive cost to go and do.
Yeah, I think it just, the number of times we've done this, we've had over 200 clients across New Zealand, probably more now, over the past, decade. I feel really old saying that. But yeah, I've just seen it have such a big impact in so many different scenarios in beef and sheep and in dairy, and they haven't always been really obvious cases of animal health issues, right? Where it is particularly useful is understanding metabolic risk in dairy herds. So knowing how much magnesium and lime flour to support your cows with through calving, understanding the risks in the diet that are contributing to that metabolic risk, so that ultimately you can use less supplementation, so you're saving cost there, but also, knowing for every clinical milk fever cow, you've got 20 subclinicals that is costing you in production. If you start addressing that, then there are huge savings to be had there, and that's nothing compared to the cost of 2 or 3 pasture samples, right? So yeah, I think there's just huge gains to be made.
Yeah. You've actually triggered a question that I got from one of my farmers the other day, which is around, dusting magnesium on the pastures beforehand. Is it better to do that, or is it actually better to try and solve the soil issue from your experience, or actually get that plant diversity in there to try and, I guess, bring that into their system as well?
Yeah, I think definitely in the short term, because nothing's instant, you'll need to use the magnesium to prevent it. But yeah, I think identifying what the underlying causes of that magnesium requirement are. So, what are your pasture potassium levels like? Are they contributing to a magnesium deficiency in the animal? And then, so that might mean looking at your effluent application rates. It might be looking at your potassium fertilizer application rates if you're using those, and lowering those if it's high. Yeah, it would be looking at the salt levels in your pastures, because salt's really important, or sodium's really important in that metabolic risk profile. And then also, what are your magnesium levels like? And so then it's thinking about the ways that we can address that, right? So could we, do we need to put magnesium fertilizer on? Could we diversify our pasture species, lift calcium levels, decrease potassium levels? So, yeah.
Oh, that's good. That's very helpful for me in my next conversation with him. That's going to be great. Thank you for that. So I guess when we look at our livestock, and some of those symptoms are obviously subclinical, what are some sure signs that you regularly see that are plant nutrition issues that show up in the livestock?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's becoming, because supplementation is so common and most farmers are on top of it, right?
Yeah.
Those clinical symptoms, aren't very common. In terms of subclinicals, it's really difficult, right? So when I think about lameness, I think of it as largely a nutritional issue, which I'm not sure everyone does. So yes, there is, issues with races and that kind of stuff, but excess protein in the diet is going to contribute to lameness. It's going to soften the hoof. There's a whole host of trace minerals that are involved in hoof health. So again, it's about understanding, are those needs being met? Often farmers will use off-the-shelf trace element blends or products, and sometimes they're not appropriate for that particular farm, right? So it's kind of like we're just throwing something at it. And yes, it is going to be useful, but I think being able to break it down and understand the exact requirements and then customizing blends and stuff is so useful. And that's where we had really good results, is where we could actually customize the approach, because your farm's going to be very different to your neighbor's farm, even if you're on the same soil type, just through management, fertilizer use, that kind of stuff. I think I've gotten a bit off topic, but yeah.
No, I think it's very important, because we do see the off-the-shelf things, and I guess it's being aware that you can actually create antagonisms because of the interactions between minerals without knowing that as well. So you might unintentionally make things worse without trying to do so. But where I've seen some of my farmers use the custom blends, I've seen things turn around very, very quickly in terms of production and cow health. So it is a very useful thing to be aware of, I believe.
Absolutely.
I think if we bring it... There you go.
I was just going to say, it also gives you the ability to customize through the season, as well as animal requirements and pasture levels change.
So if you're doing that, you'd obviously be taking regular herbage tests throughout the season to see how things are changing? Yeah.
So lining them up with your key management periods is a really good way of doing it. So, in a dairy system, pre-calving, pre-mating, and then late lactation, their requirements are going to change through that period, and your season changes, and therefore your pasture composition changes. And then similar in sheep and beef instances as well. Pre-mating, pre-breeding. Maybe if you're looking at lamb growth in particular, understanding the requirement for lamb growth, can be really useful.
I think if we bring it back to, you mentioned protein before, and I see it quite regularly that there's a lot of excess protein in particularly a lot of our pastures that are just ryegrass and clover, particularly at this time of year. They're getting pretty high. Does that have any influence on the minerals as well? It's like if they are trying to get rid of that excess protein, are they also leaching out minerals as well?
Yeah, I'm just trying to remember. I'm pretty sure, if someone's listening and I've got it wrong, that's fine. But I'm pretty sure excess protein will have an impact on magnesium absorption in your cows. So again, that could play into metabolic risk and subclinical metabolics. The biggest cost of that excess protein is that they have to use energy to process it. So, And it's the same with excess mineral as well. If there's, if you're giving too much, well, for a start, too much magnesium can actually cause milk fever-like symptoms in cattle. So, but on the other hand, if you've got excesses of any mineral, then energy is required to process that and excrete it. That's where it's really important to have that balance right.
Yeah, it's a conversation I have regularly with my farmers around like milk urea nitrogens. Like if you're seeing them high, it's actually the animal just using energy trying to excrete that, and that could be better utilised going towards producing milk or getting into reproduction. So just having that regular conversation about how can we actually manage this and improve this going forward. So when we start, like if a farmer's seeing metabolic issues, where do you think they should start looking? Is it the soil test? We've obviously talked about ranges of different testing you can do already from the animal right through to the soil. Where should they start looking to try and identify an issue that might be present?
Yeah, well, my go-to would be to look at the mineral profile of the diet that they're on, but not just that they're currently on. It's also thinking back to, okay, what's happening in that dry cow period? So there's a lot of risk factors in that dry cow diet that can contribute to your metabolics overcalving. One of those is high calcium levels in the dry cow diet. And that's really common because, we're wintering our cows on kale. So then it's thinking about what is the transition period that I'm allowing coming off that kale into calving? And am I dropping those dietary calcium levels low enough to trigger the calcium homeostatic mechanism? So for me, it's really about going to the diet, making sure first of all, intakes and energy intake is sufficient, because as a woman who's given birth, it's it's pretty damn hard. So just making sure those cows are fully supported through that period in terms of energy. But definitely going to the mineral profile in the short term, the mineral profile of the pasture or feed. If you're using supplements like maize silage or something like that, it's kind of understanding, how they're contributing as well. So what are the risks or advantages of using those supplementary feeds?
Yeah, I think it's an important point to realise is just so through those periods how it does shift what the cow needs. And I didn't realise that cow had high calcium in it. That's quite fascinating, especially when I see guys now going away from fodder beet back to cow. It's seeming to becoming more prevalent. If they're aware of that, what can you do, I guess, through that period when they are on cow? Is it supplementing through minerals or feed to try and buffer that higher calcium uptake?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of farmers are moving to transitional mineral blends, so to get the DCAD in the diet right. So, and that's kind of come from those high input systems. It's quite difficult to lower the DCAD enough in a grass-based system, but there's a lot of transition blends now that will do that and that do minimize that risk. And just because you're on kale doesn't mean you're going to end up with metabolic issues every time. I think it's just, thinking a bit more about, where I have seen issues is where you do have the higher calcium in the kale combined with high sulfur levels. So also thinking about your sulfur, that plays into your goitrogenic substances in the kale and the risk that they have as well. And so, I think it's understanding that kale-based diet as well, and then adjusting for anything that might be out of balance, transitioning to a low calcium diet prior to calving. And then thinking about how, that post-calving diet, how you're supporting those magnesium and calcium levels.
I see lime that goes on quite regularly before in the lead up to planting of winter feed crops. So would that exacerbate the calcium uptake as well that's going into those crops?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it would probably depend where your calcium levels are starting. But I think kale anyway is just going to accumulate more calcium than a grass, say.
Yeah, and I guess the reason why they're putting on the lime is because they have low available calcium in the first place. So they're trying to raise it, and it's not going to break down instantly and be available to the plant. So potentially it might be it's probably most likely not an issue.
No, I think you're wanting to support that soil health as well. So
yeah,
and the plants that come after the kale.
A huge amount of positive impacts for. So if we look at, we've talked about quite a range of I guess, minerals so far. Are there any specific minerals and then also ratios that you find are most correlated to the reproductive success of cows or just livestock in general? I guess it's different for each type.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, that's a good question. I think, it's interesting. I tend not to focus on ratios, although they're definitely useful. There will be some imbalances that will increase that risk in terms of reproductive success or metabolic issues. But I tend to look at the status of each mineral in the diet and then work through how each of them is impacting on those outcomes. Having said that, the most common trace elements that are tied up in reproductive function are copper, selenium, and iodine. So an insufficiency or a deficiency in any one of those could have a negative effect on reproductive outcomes. And again, like we talked about, bloods and livers may not always pick this up. And then, in terms of metabolic risk, I most commonly find where there's an excess of phosphorus and potassium, that is going to cause issues and increase your metabolic risk. And then, so it's about thinking, if I've got high potassium, that's going to influence my magnesium levels in the plant. It's also going to influence the magnesium absorption in the animal. So that'd be a big red flag for me. The other one is, your sodium potassium balance. If you've got really low sodium in your pastures, it's going to affect palatability. And then that's going to impact your energy overall. So there's definitely some things that you can think about that are those first kind of red flags.
Yeah, absolutely.
Leading to that risk.
Yeah, my one that I've been learning a bit more about lately has been sodium, because I do regularly see it as low in a lot of my pastures as well as the soil. And knowing that does have such a greater outcome for livestock. It's always interesting when, people put it out ad lib and it gets absolutely smashed for like 2 weeks by the cows or the sheep, and then they just don't touch it for a while and drop off. Is that so because they built up enough within their system so they only need little bits going forward? Or is it more about that time of year when it's been put out?
I think it's probably a combination of both. Those levels will fluctuate in the pastures. So, you're going to see differences throughout the year. The other thing is that self-medication or self-selection operates on a kind of a feedback loop. So, it's not until they realize, oh, actually, I feel sick because I need sodium, that they're going to seek it out because they've associated feeling better with that sodium. And so, there'll be a period of, okay, they've built up their levels and then they start to drop again before they realize, oh, okay, I need to go back and get some more of that stuff. So, there's a bit of a feedback loop going on there in terms of that self-selection as well.
Yeah. Something I have been exploring on this, and which has kind of led me down the rabbit hole around sodium, is the form in which it is. Like, some people will advocate that if you use a sea mineral form or, utilising fish hydrolysates on your pasture, and that makes it obviously more palatable, but it's a better, more available form to get into the cow is generally what it's been in a dairy sense. Have you had any experience or, experiments around that?
Yeah, I actually haven't. I'd be really curious too to know the difference and if there is really a difference. I think, in dairy systems where, it's, I guess in more conventional dairy systems where you've got some in-shed feed as well, then it's really easy. Farmers generally just add salt to the in-shed feed or have, the loose leak free choice salt there. But I'd be really curious to know what's at play there.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by it as well. I'm like,
we might need to organise some trials.
Yeah, I just would like to do, I suppose it's more around when we're adding, salt to a fertiliser mix and putting it out, maybe in terms of how it goes into the soil and then becomes biologically available through to the plant. Yeah. It might, obviously with using sea minerals or fish hydrolysate, you're stimulating the soil microbiology at the same time. So that might be the process that makes it more available quickly. But it's an area that I'm fascinated about.
Yeah, if you think about sea minerals as well, or they're going to have a lot of other compounds that are beneficial, other minerals as well in trace amounts. So
absolutely. And I guess there's some sort of like the energy of the water and stuff is coming through into it as well. Some people are claiming. So it's kind of one of my little focus areas at the moment that I'm like, Well, if this is just a simple switch in terms of the sodium that we're trying to get into the system, that can have quite a big outcome for the performance of the animal.
Yeah.
That would be a great thing to be able to pull on that lever at times where it's needed.
Yeah, interesting.
So we've talked about the minerals quite a bit. How does, I guess, the plant diversity within a pasture, how does that help to build resilience for both, obviously, the plants, but also the animals as well?
Yeah, diversity plays a massive role in terms of building resilience. Kind of from a plant point of view, I tend to think about it that each plant uses resources differently and has a different role to play. So that kind of functional diversity piece, right? And so it goes kind of beyond thinking, oh, how many species, as to like how different are they as well. It's having those different functionally diverse groups, or functional groups like your legumes and clovers. Sorry, clovers are legumes and herbs, plantain, etc. Deep taprooted plants. So what are the different functions that they're offering, and how does the system become more stable because of this? So then not all the plants fail under the same stress, right? And they're also, with all these different root types, we're supporting different microbial communities. So those communities become more complex, and then you build that kind of diversity underground, which then plays back up into plant health, right? So it's more able to support plant health from that microbial diversity. From the animal point of view, just like humans, ruminants thrive on like a diverse diet. And there's kind of three areas that I think about. When you start to add other functional groups other than just grasses, you end up with more phytochemicals in the system. So secondary plant compounds, these are things like tannins, for example. And if we think about, ruminants in a natural system, they might consume up to like 50 plant species a day, right? So yeah, they're used to being able to seek out what they need. And in doing this, they're ingesting like huge amounts of phytochemical compounds. And these have beneficial effects on the body. So, they can act as antiparasitic compounds. So anthelmintic, they have antibacterial and antiviral properties, antifungal properties. So there's a lot of medicinal function that comes from some of these phytochemically rich plants. And they all help to improve the health of the animal. The other thing that diversity will do is just improve the mineral balance within the pastures. So, they'll take up minerals at different rates depending on their root structure. And so the more diversity of plants you've got, the more likely, it's going to depend on your soil type and soil levels, but the more likely you are to kind of even out balance those mineral levels. And then in terms of those phytochemicals, again, they help to improve oxidative stress. So they help to combat that in animals, and also just allowing for choice. So that kind of hedonic well-being in animals is really important, and it has shown to actually improve health and performance when they have choice.
Yeah, that's the fascinating thing, isn't it? That when you've got a happy animal that can express its own choice, it actually performs better. And there are studies that prove it as well. I think, like you hit it on the head, people get really worried about diversity because they automatically think of 25 to 30 species and it's sunflowers and all sorts of things. But it's actually more about just those functional groups more so than the massive amounts of diversity in the first place, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. It's about thinking of the role of each of those things. What role are they playing, and have I got that covered? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's like, what role are they trying to play in my system, and do I have that covered? Because if I don't, then there's going to be issues that show up eventually. So you can like to think of it as you can have all the perfect soil tests and all the right mineral levels, but if you don't have the functional biology and the functional diversity there to access it, it doesn't really mean a lot, does it? Because you can't access the whole pantry.
Yeah.
I think the really key thing around the shift to diversity is around grazing management. How does that impact, or what feedback does that give to plant health, and then I guess the nutrient density that is a result of that?
I guess, when we're thinking about grazing management, we're thinking residuals, rotation periods, and then rest periods and recovery. So if I'm thinking about, higher residuals, then you're leaving behind more leaf area. This means you're going to have faster photosynthesis, right? So the plant's going to recover quicker. Where you have very low residuals, then the plant needs to draw on the carbohydrate reserves to grow. And so that's going to be a slower recovery of growth. And then where you get that repeated severe grazing or overgrazing, you're reducing your root mass and root depth, and also those mycorrhizal associations. And then that plays into, particularly with mycorrhizal association, that'll play into phosphate availability to the plant. So, you're kind of cutting off your feet. You're interrupting that mineral cycle. So yeah, that's how I think about it in terms of plant health. The higher the residual, well, if you can leave enough residual, if you can create enough rest time or recovery period, then you're going to have that whole cycle working better for you, that whole mineral cycle working better for you. And that will play into the plant health. In terms of animals, I think that comes through in what the mineral density or the nutritional density of your pastures. And also if we think about the plant development phases, right? And so when you're actually grazing them, in a short rotation, you've got your higher crude protein levels, your higher sugar levels, lower fiber levels, right? And so, and potentially total mineral concentrations are lower when you've got that lush, say, spring growth or whatever. And then when you've got longer rotations, you've got, a slightly more mature plant, you've got your higher structural fiber. And I think, we tend to get a bit caught up on quality. But the rumen is actually made to digest fiber. So I think we can do with a little bit more fiber in our animal diets. That also tends to influence the mineral profile. So yeah, I think depending on how you're grazing, it's going to influence what the animal's actually ingesting.
Yeah, you really hit the nail on the head there around the quality piece, because that was going to be my follow-up question, is that people are so scared of losing quality that if they see any seed head or some fibre, that they think their animals aren't going to perform as well. And actually, that fibre is really important for the rumen to actually function. And actually, potentially, they will perform better with that in their system than just that really high crude protein that we typically deal with in summertime. So do you see lengthening out those rotations helps, or that round length helps with that?
Yeah, definitely. And I was, I hear farmers say a lot, but I did get a drop in performance or whatever when my pastures became more fibrous. You lose protein. But I think it's keeping in mind that it does take time for the rumen to adjust, right? So how do we keep that plane of nutrition the same? How do we not move from really high protein pastures to putting them onto something that's quite long and rank? So if we can come back at the right time, each time, where we have that good mix of protein and fiber, and keep that nutritional plane constant, then that's where you're going to see, the animal performance.
Yeah, and I think from some of the other conversations I've had on this podcast is it's around that consistency of feed. If you can focus on consistently feeding the ruminant well, and then not having to adjust as much, that's when you get that really good performance coming through, provided that's a complete diet.
Yeah.
So there's a few things to juggle.
Yeah. We're simplifying it all down really well.
Well, that's what we want to do. We're trying to simplify this so someone can go away and take a few of these concepts and apply them to what they're doing, or at least review what they're doing to see if there's an opportunity there.
Yeah.
And that's the main thing, is how can we improve the farm system? And most of it, like I keep coming back to, and I know we talked about it, was around the farm system design. But if we really want to have high-performing livestock, we actually have to feed them well, like we would any sort of athlete. You're trying to get all the right feed and energy into the system so that they can do well. And I think whether it's a dairy cow, a deer, a stag, a ram, or a ewe, we all want to make them perform really well. And if we provide them with all the tools, then they can do so.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you're on the Create program at the moment, Create Australia. How are you finding that so far?
Amazing. Challenging and amazing. Yeah, it's such a fantastic course. Yeah. There's just so much to learn. There's so much technical knowledge that comes through, but I think, there's also so much personal growth work that gets done through that course. And for me, I think that's probably been the biggest thing, that the biggest advantage, getting some insights into myself that I perhaps didn't have beforehand, understanding, how I communicate and my behaviors, and then, being provided with the skills and tools, to deal with the inevitable chaos of life. Right. So, yeah, I think, it's just such a powerful course.
No, I totally agree. And I think, for me, I'd probably linked into the personal development side a little bit harder than the technical, and that's where the real growth came, and then the technical comes alongside that as you grow. So
Yeah.
it's a fantastic journey. Do you have any of your biggest learning? I know you're not fully finished yet, but have you got a big learning that you've taken away so far?
Oh, I can't. I just can't narrow it down. I
Yeah.
think, yeah, there's just, oh, no, actually, one thing that I've gained is understanding the importance of asking questions, right? So just always asking the questions. And I think we can sometimes get scared to ask questions, but it's so powerful, you know. It's so powerful what you can learn, and it's so powerful what the person that you're asking the question of can learn. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think like as you ask more questions, you get better at asking questions. And obviously as your question standard raises, the answers you get better too, and you learn more. So it's a fantastic thing. And I like to always remind myself if I'm sitting in a room and I'm feeling worried about asking a question that there'll be three other people in the room who've probably got the same question who are also worried that they think it's a dumb question. So yeah, there's no such thing as a dumb question, I think. No. And just having the confidence to actually just ask it can be such a game changer for a lot of people, I think.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, because there's you either perceived expectation or expectation on you that you should know these things, you know, as a farmer, as a consultant, as anyone in their field. But we're all human. We don't know everything, and there's nothing wrong with asking a question if you don't know. And for me, that's a huge learning.
Oh, absolutely. And everyone can teach you something as well, so don't be afraid to ask them some questions. There's people are doing some very interesting things around the place. So if you approach it like that with curiosity, it really makes life a lot more fun too, I think.
Yeah.
So I guess, we're seeing a bit of work done on the functional diversity in pasture-based systems if we bring it back there. Where do you think, if we look down the track, maybe 10, 20 years, do you think we're going to develop or see a change in our pasture-based systems and how they're utilised going forward?
That's a really good question. I would love to see that change. And I think the opportunity there is huge, right? So the opportunity to embrace that diversity in our pastures and trees on farm as well, not just pastures, but all plants. And then in our animals and our enterprises, I think, you know, because diversity brings resilience into our farming systems. And, you know, if we think about, you know, the weather systems are getting more chaotic, how do we build resilience into these systems? And I think diversity is definitely one way to achieve that. And then I also think about it from, you know, just the sheer amount of land that is under this kind of management, livestock management, and the opportunity that we have there to heal some of our ecosystems, right? So to improve water cycle functioning, improve mineral cycle functioning. And I think these pasture-based livestock systems are part of the answer to doing that. And I think farmers have a huge role to play in that. So, yeah.
Yeah, totally agree with everything you just said there. I think trees are such a cool opportunity in farm systems, and we all know where we go to those farms that have just like a huge amount of trees and how beautiful and vibrant they are. So it always confuses me when people are trying to eradicate the trees out of their property, not realising that it has all these other positive effects, particularly when you get a sheer number of them across the landscape too.
Yeah, I think you know, maybe we're tending to view it as competition, you know, so whereas if we start to think about the benefits that they're providing, you know, your shade, your shelter, from an animal point of view, also nutrition, right? So there's a lot of edible trees that have excellent medicinal compounds and nutrients in them. So how can, you know, is there a way that we can integrate them into our system as feed as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And after seeing photos of Gavin Fisher's place again last week, it always just makes me wonder how much you can achieve by actually having so much more of that kind of vertical plane of eating as well for animals too.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's definitely something we forget about, you know.
Yeah, build the farm upwards a little bit before expanding
outwards. Remember to look up.
Yeah. So if there's kind of one key message you'd like a livestock farmer to take away about plant nutrition and how that relates to animal health, what would that be?
Yeah, I think it's just that understanding that they are intimately linked, right? So you can't separate them. That is the the main feed for our animals. So that plant health is going to come through into that animal health and performance. So just, understanding that link, and then understanding the risk on their own farm. Your pastures and your animals are going to be different to your neighbours. So uncovering those factors that are contributing to your particular situation, I think, are key to preventing and correcting some of that system dysregulation. Yeah.
Love that. So I finish up my podcast with one question for all my guests, and that is, what's one belief or principle that keeps you grounded no matter what season you're in?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm not an overly spiritual person, so that's quite, quite challenging. And I mean, it is really challenging to stay grounded. I think, particularly these days, life is chaotic. But for me, it's always reminding myself about the complexity and awe of nature. So, acknowledging that we're all complex biological beings and how inextricably linked we are to our environment. And so no matter how often we try to remove ourselves from it or keep ourselves above it, we are part of it. And for me, that thought, pondering on that, keeps me really, really grounded.
Yeah, that is such a fantastic way to finish this podcast. We are nature, we're not separate. So in closing, if listeners are keen to learn more about your work or about following along what you do, where can they connect with you?
Yeah, so they can find me on LinkedIn. Is probably the best place, Emily House. And please get in touch. Looking forward to some good conversations.
No worries. I'll put a link to your LinkedIn in the bottom of this podcast so everyone can connect with you. But thank you very much for your time today, Emily. It's been a great chat, and I've got some answers to some questions as well that I needed answers, which is always awesome.
Awesome. Thanks, Conan. That was, fantastic discussion.